Hello, everyone. I'm Olga Mayorova, director of Greece, and it's pleasure to introduce our today's speaker, Professor Buckley. Let me tell you a little bit about her research. Cynthia Buckley is a professor of sociology at the University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, and senior consultant for Eurasia at the Social Science Research Council. A social demographer, she joined the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign after several years at the University of Texas, Austin. Her research examines the cumulative effects of institutional and cultural change on individual and demographic decision-making and the implications of the demographic change for human security. She has served as a scientific expert for UNESCO on the Southern Caucasus, a methodological advisor for the International Finance Corporation, and a consultant for numerous government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and private businesses. So lots of work has been done by Professor Buckley. Publications from her previous research projects cover issues of rural development, population aging, maternal and child health, reproductive health, and HIV/AIDS problems. She is presently completing a book on the sociocultural implications of male labor migration in the Southern Caucasus. And she's the primary investigator on the project People, Power, and Conflict in the Eurasian Migration System. This project funded through NSF Minerva Initiative. This project examines the geopolitical implications of Russia emergence as an international migration destination state. So we will have today, I believe, piece of your current project to be talked about. A few words about our next meeting, our next week's event. Next week's Greece Noon lecture will be our speaker will be Morgan Liu, who completed his PhD in anthropology and now teaches at Ohio State University. He will speak on the topic of the Uzbek conundrum, or how society within a society was built and then disseminated in Kyrgyzstan in 1990s through 2010. And I forgot to mention that Cynthia's lecture today is co-sponsored by Rackham's Centennial Lecture Series, which has been showcasing the university's most distinguished alumni during the month of October 2012. So please join me in welcoming Professor Buckley.
Thank you very much, Olga. I have been joking with my colleagues that Rackham must have been thinking when they gave me Halloween that I must actually, instead of the most distinguished, must be among the scariest alumni at the University of Michigan, and I'll take that moniker. I might share it with Professor Ostadal, but it's really a pleasure to be back in Ann Arbor, a very different Ann Arbor than the one I left a long time ago. Certainly a lot more buildings, a lot more activity, but it's always kind of like coming home to come back to the Ann Arbor campus. And so for the graduate students in the audience, first of all, I know you hate hearing this, but this really is the best time of your career and the most fun time of your career, where you make the best colleagues and really have the opportunity to learn so much. And so I hope you have an opportunity later to come back to home and to the campus. And if you do, you better kick back your honoraria too, okay? Those are the rules. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about this project that I've been working on over the past many years, called the People, Power, People, Power, and Conflict, the Emergence of the Eurasian Migration System. And this is funded through a Department of Defense initiative that's channeled through the National Science Foundation, called the Minerva Initiative, that was started by Secretary Gates and has been continued under Secretary Panetta. And what this is trying to do is to bring social scientists into national security and international security conversations. You know, it's not black ops. I got no secret decoder ring, much to my chagrin. There are no embargoes on your research, but this is an attempt to kind of backtrack away from what was perhaps some questionable processes that were adopted through the Human Terrain Project, and a way to say we need social scientists to help us engage in conversations about security, but also a really exciting movement in the part of the Defense Department to think about security completely differently. It's not bombs and rockets anymore. It's about human security, it's about economic security, and it's about social stability. And if that's going to continue to be their focus, I encourage the social scientists in the audience to pay attention to the Minerva Project. They just had a call for their white papers. They have another big funding round coming up in January, and they've already got the budget approved, which is unheard of in Washington, for subsequent years. It's a sizable amount of money in a very, very tight funding landscape. So I encourage you to think a little bit about that. So just a little bit of thanks here, our program manager who has to suffer through my constant flipping in and out of the academy, some of my collaborators, but I also want to point out that one of my junior scholars on the project is a Michigan sociology PhD student, Everett Peachy, and he spent a fun-filled month in Nizhny Novgorod with me, hanging out at the Vietnamese migrant market. Okay, so a little bit of context. What we did in this project is to really try and examine Russia's emergence as a migration destination state. A lot of people don't think about Russia as a place people are fighting to get into. We're used to, from the Cold War, as thinking about Russia as a place people fight to get out of. But actually, Russia is second only to the United States in the number of foreign-born citizens that are resident within its border. And so to gather this information, really think systematically about what that means for geopolitical stability in the region, we undertook a massive data collection effort. And I post some of the things that we've got up here. All of this data is open access now. We're slated for inclusion in the ICPSR archives probably in early 2014. So if you need any of this stuff beforehand, or if anyone's working on migration, please get a hold of me. You really don't want to go through the 2,374 laws on migration passed at the national level since 1991. We'll just give you the file, okay? One of the things we just finished recently was a survey of 601 labor migrants in Russian cities. 3 cities, Krasnodar, Nizhny Novgorod, and Ekaterinburg. And this is the first multi-site survey of migrants in the Russian Federation. We asked all sorts of questions. We employed some innovative sampling techniques. We tried respondent-driven sampling, which was quite an amazing thing, and succeeded in completing respondent-driven sampling in 2 of the 3 sites, and learned an enormous amount along the way. But the data set that has been constructed, we've finished, we've got the sampling correction set, and the data files are open, and there's information on the migration process, on remittances, and on human security at their place of destination. So why is everybody coming to Russia? Because as bad as things can be in Russia, they have a positive economic growth rate. And you know what? Migration isn't about going to the best place. It's going to the place that's a little better than the one you're in. And for many people in the former Soviet Union, particularly individuals in the Southern Caucasus and in Central Asia, Russia is a fantastic destination. There are very few economic opportunities in these countries. So Central Asia particularly, and I'm sure Morgan will be touching on this later in the talk next week, has had very questionable economic policies over the past 20 years, with the exception of Kazakhstan, which is starting to emerge as a migration destination for many of the Central Asian countries. these countries really focus on migration as a means of survival. And this came through with the 200 migrant surveys that we conducted over the past 3 years. People aren't going because they want to buy a Zhiguli or they want to have a really big wedding for their firstborn son. They're going for basic family survival. They want their kids to have shoes. They want to be able to support elderly parents whose pensions have been torn asunder through economic reforms. And so they're highly motivated to come into Russia through a variety of legal and illegal manners. And why? So they can send money home. This is from the Russian Central Bank, and this is in millions of US dollars. This is reported by the quarter, too, to keep in mind, that every quarter we're looking at over $1 billion US dollars leaving the Russian economy and going to the sending regions. This is a huge amount of money. And this is the estimated personal remittances. And while they're highly motivated and certainly are taking a lot of financial resources out, they face a lot of risks in Russia. So this is just some preliminary crosstabs from our survey. And we asked people about what they had witnessed or what they had heard about, because we're trying to get at this idea of the mythology of violence, right? Everybody's heard about a migrant who got beat up, but how many of you have seen one? Well, unfortunately, a lot of them have seen them. So this is the results for violence that they have witnessed in the 3 cities. Poor treatment, it's well over a quarter. Forced to pay bribes, it's almost a third in the city of Nizhny Novgorod. Violence against migrants is also quite high. And this wasn't just shoving. This had to be, it was, in Russian, we put серьезное насилие, serious violence against migrants. 16% in the overall sample, lowest in Ekaterinburg, or lower in Ekaterinburg, 14%, quite low in Nizhny. This has to do with the isolation of migrants in enclaves at construction sites in the city. But again, 21.5% in Krasnodar. So 1 in 5 violence. 1 in 5 migrants are actually witnessing serious violence. And I should say, again, this is in the past 12 months. So this is a fairly difficult situation for them. Aside from the risks that individual migrants face, there's also risks at the macro level as well. And this has to do with the emergence of Russia as what I would call the first non-liberal destination state. We always think about destination states in migration studies as liberal states that enable migrants to enrich themselves, and that's why they come. It's tough, particularly given the last 12 months and some of the changes in the new regime, to put Russia in the liberal state category. They don't really fit. And so what we're seeing is a really unique and fascinating example of a quasi-liberal state using migration as a tool in international politics. There's increasing evidence that labor market access is being utilized for political influence. Perhaps some of you had heard 4 months ago, Russia and Tajikistan signed a new agreement to have Russian troops on the Tajik border, right, in the guise of anti-drug trafficking. What was not as highly publicized is that at the same time, the very same day, Tajikistan also got 400,000 new labor permits for temporary migrants. So there's definitely a tit-for-tat negotiation process going on there that goes back through the early 1990s, actually, before the Tajik Civil War. It's increasingly clear that political motivations are driving migration policy. The Kyrgyz, who were kind of shined upon for a while, have had some difficulties politically and now have had their labor quotas cut. Karimov in Uzbekistan, who has been kowtowing a bit to the Medvedev and now Putin administration, has seen their labor quotas go up. And one of the reasons, well, interestingly enough, one of the times when the labor quotas went up was the day after Karimov signed a new oil agreement to buy Russian oil. So there's a clear negotiation process coming on, and it's a really interesting process for migration scholars because we like to think that the destination states of Western Europe and North America really did not try to overly politicize migration. I have some colleagues who are Latin American specialists who would argue with me on that, but I think that Russia does provide, shall we say, a very clear case of a quasi-liberal regime. So migration is a key policy issue, and it's kind of funny to me to hear all these Russian politicians taking quotes from American politicians. Right. And of course, nobody ever gets cited. So Medvedev just recently this summer was talking about, migration now is our #1 problem. We've got to do something, right? And his quote you could read for any American politician, right? Individuals must be registered, norms followed, and taxes paid, right? Something must be done. Interestingly enough, you go back to Sam Brownback, a very energetic promoter of immigration reform. Everybody recognizes the current system is not working the way we want it to. It has huge flaws. Something needs to be done, right? So we've got to do something, but what is to be done? Well, some of my colleagues have argued that I pulled this topic out as the most boring aspect of migration in Russia. So I want to apologize first. But secondly, I want to argue that what we need to do when we're looking at migration in Russia is to kind of shy away from the sizzle, right? The sad stories, the individual cases, the beatings, right? Because they're serious and they deserve study, but they're not as huge in terms of informing public policy as things like estimating how many migrants there are. And I think that we need to focus on estimation because statistics are important, right? They shape the way public discourse emerges. If you think there are only 5 million migrants, you speak very differently than if you think there are 50. And if politicians can sway you into believing that there are 20, you are much more likely to be supportive of very restrictive policies, as opposed to someone who highlights the fact that there are 1.2 empty jobs at the present time in the Russian Federation. I wouldn't encourage any of our recent graduates to go take those jobs. They're not real high-skill, high-wage jobs, but still, it's a war of statistics. And in this war, I think it's good to have accuracy, right? You don't want people spraying statistics everywhere. So how are migration estimates done? And are there systematic variations by method and by source? Also, I want to end us with thinking a little bit about the political and economic implications of not really knowing, right? Keeping the numbers soft and who benefits from that sort of a situation. Sometimes some people benefit from not knowing. So I think Tony Blair sums up the whole situation with migration really nicely, right? If you want to look at a country, you measure yourself by how many people want in, right? That seems pretty good, and that certainly serves the US very well. But what also happens then is that you have, from then candidate Obama in 2008, thinking about the 12 million people at that point that were estimated that were living in the shadows, right? That weren't really registered. As opposed to President Putin, this summer, who is really looking and using the rhetoric of cracking down on migration. We've got to register these people. We've got to control our borders, right? And we're going to do it. And that's quite ominous given his record with the use of administrative force. But at the same time, everybody knows it's a problem. There's numbers everywhere. And what I love about this part of studying migration is that unlike public health, in reproductive health, where people are like, well, we think there's a problem with this or that, people, when they talk about migration, just make stuff up. And it's hysterical to go to some of these conferences and just hear the stuff that gets spouted, right? So Zurabov, who is was the public health minister before he resigned in scandal, as so many politicians do. 1 in 10 migrant workers suffers from infectious diseases like HIV, tuberculosis, or hepatitis. Where did that number come from? Right? Not unlike our dear state senator Pierce in Arizona, always a treasure trove when one is looking for fabulous quotes about migration, had a huge editorial in the New York Times that got a lot of press and constantly is blogging about the fact that immigrants commit crime. Because if you look at the prison, there is a higher percentage of immigrants than there are foreign-born people, according to the American Community Survey. So immigrants obviously commit crime more often. Now, I would argue perhaps immigrants are not good criminals. They get caught more often. And so maybe, you know, it's good to have, if you're going to have criminals, bad ones are the ones you want because you can catch them. But again, it's this idea that I know how many there are and I can figure out and I can tell you they're either sick or they're criminal. None of these things can actually be answered in terms of whether they're efficacious or not because we don't know how many migrants we have. So we need numbers because otherwise we can't have evidence-based policy. It hurts public opinion, and more importantly, in states where there is better access to social services. And unfortunately, that list is getting shorter and shorter in the US. It's an extremely short list, 5 oblasts in the Russian Federation. It really is problematic in terms of budgeting and planning. So just last week, the ombudsmen for the oblasts in the Russian Federation were all invited to Dushanbe to come and talk about how ombudsmen, and they're the kind of troubleshooters for their region, were dealing with migrant problems in the Russian Federation, or as a Tajik official said, as they are not dealing with migrant issues across the Federation. And 201, the most common complaint, I had some colleagues help me do a survey. Out of 77 responses that we received from the 80 ombudsmen in attendance, the #1 problem was accurate information. It's not violence, it's not healthcare, it's not criminality, it's not the drug trade. They don't know how many migrants are in their region. And so I think in the US, where we love to count stuff, right? That maybe looking at US approaches to estimating both registered and unregistered migration can be informative here. And so how can we estimate either in Russia or in the US? We can look at official statistics, and those are pointless because most people don't come in officially, right? You're here on a tourist visa, you cross the Rio Grande, you do other things than come and register with all your paperwork. We can use census data. And we know that that has poor coverage and that we should all be using sampling, but we can't get politicians to understand how that works, so that's not going to help us. Okay, we can use surveys. They're very expensive, but if done well, can be really useful, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We can also use apprehension data, and this was a really bad trend in migration studies, I have to tell you. Again, very popular in the South, and Texas being part of that. We would try and utilize the number of people who got caught crossing the border. Again, so they're like the bad criminals, we're really only measuring the bad migrants who do get apprehended on the border. And then there's all sorts of indirect indicators, tax records, school enrollment, hospital, but this is limited and they're typically not nationally systematic. So what do we use in the US where we have lots of data, right? The Census Department has several things that they're doing. They have a whole division for demographic analysis. They like to rely on the American Community Survey for migration estimation. Typically, according to another Michigan alum, Tori Velkoff, who's deputy director of the estimation division, they really try not to factor in issues of legality anywhere in any of the surveys, and have been very, very adamant in staying out of the debate about how many are legal, how many are illegal. Probably the gold standard for demographers in terms of migration estimation in the United States is the work done by Jeffrey Passell and his colleagues through the Pew Charitable Trust. They use the March Current Population Survey. They look at mortality data, they look at data from Mexico, and incorporate the American Community Survey for those people over 16. And they try to differentiate by registration. How many are registered migrants and how many are not registered migrants. Homeland Security also has its own division that estimates migration. They are trying to do it not so much by legality, but actually by country of origin. And Homeland Security, again, relies on ACLS. They use what demographers call the residual approach, which is always a little hinky, right? You take the population, you project it forward, but it relies on a lot of assumptions about mortality and health behaviors, and also can be quite problematic. But Homeland Security, not surprisingly, does separate out legal and illegal. And then once there was an interesting, I got to tell this story because now, since we all hate investment bankers, once there was a very, very misguided foray into demographic estimation done by Bear Stearns, right? They had lots of money to fund it, so that's good. They relied on remittances. And this generated the very highest estimates of all. One of the criticisms of the Bear Stearns idea is that they had taken as an assumption that people would only remit twice a year. And so if you sent money home every month, you actually got counted as 6 migrants. But their defense was that, you know, we're not looking at this as demographers. We just want to know how much we can charge people every time they send money home. So we're just as happy with that high estimate. How do they estimate migrants in Russia? Well, there's a lot of stuff going on. There are border statistics, and any of you who have traveled to the Russian Federation lately have filled out your fabulous migration card, right? And that great little piece of paper, and don't you ever lose that second part of your migration card because they won't let you out, right? You have to have one piece when you go in and another piece when you go out. There is a huge warehouse out by the airport where there are, it's a lot like the end scene of Raiders of the Lost Ark, just rows and rows of long shoeboxes. Sorry about that. Long shoeboxes that are filled with these migration cards. So there's a dissertation project for about 300 students if you ever get them interested in it. But border statistics are really rarely used. What they have been reliant upon primarily is something that they call expert assessments. Krasnitz is a perfect example of this, and I can't fault them for this strategy because they were really working in the absence of a lot of concrete data. But what Krasnitz did, he said, you know, I think I know who the top 50 demographers are, and so I'm going to send them a survey. I'm going to ask them, how many migrants do you think there are? And, you know, they coalesced within, primarily, the standard deviation wasn't that big. And so he came up with a number, and they kind of liked that strategy. And my argument is that you know, I love my colleagues there dearly, but I believe that basically people like being told they're an expert. So people were highly participant in this strategy, and this continues to this day, these expert assessments. The Federal Migration Service has come on more recently and just started. This is an amazing thing that was quite shocking for me. The FMS has just opened their estimation and analysis section 18 months ago. 20 years, so they have a lot of, you know, they're busy because there's lots of pent-up demand. There's also Goskomstat, and I shouldn't call them that because that's their Soviet name now, it's Russtat, but it'll always be Goskomstat to me. They have a committee on scientific methods that is supposed to focus on migration estimation. It was commissioned in 2010. They came up with an estimation that Medvedev did not like, so they were decommissioned in 2011. They have been recommissioned with a slightly different composition. However, in the fine words of the top migration expert in Russia, Zhana Janskovskaya, she looked at me and she's like, Cindy, what do you think? I'm not going back on that committee. I'll end up in the gulag. So that's a kind of questionable committee in terms of really getting good statistics. There's several excellent independent scholarly assessments, and I'll talk about those in a moment, by Vladimir Mukamel at the Institute of Sociology, Yulia Florinskaya, who works with Janskovskaya, and some of my colleagues at Moscow State University. However, these scholarly assessments tend to be funded by the government, and they have a very persistent focus on the idea of managing migration. And so what happens is, and this is a carryover from Soviet days, from a very often unread dissertation that I wrote, that there was this idea that migration was something that could be scientifically managed. And so all these studies are looking for the optimal number of migrants, which is a different question than trying to figure out how many migrants you have. I'm not sure it's a question that can be answered. Right? When you think about it, and you're teaching a class, what is the optimal number of students? We all have an idea of who is an optimal student, but that's a very different question. And so these assessments have been somewhat questionable. In terms of data sources, they don't have anything like the Current Population Survey, and they don't have really anything like the American Community Survey. We have the Russian Longitudinal Monitoring Survey, which is a woefully underutilized yearly survey that's been going on since 1993, that does ask about foreign-born and consistently shows there's about 10–11% foreign-born people in the Russian Federation. However, the RLMS is designed as a sample of housing, right? So whoever's in that house gets back in the survey. Because of the way they did the original survey, the housing units tend to be in nicer neighborhoods. Now, this tells me two things. First, they're way nicer than what used to go on in the Detroit area study, where they would send you to horrible neighborhoods to do block listing. No, they only want to send the surveyors out to nice areas. So that was kind of them. A little problematic for picking up migrants, but nice. But secondly, the estimates of the foreign-born have been dropping, which everybody knows is not correct. And so this is a little bit hard to use for estimating migration. We have the gender and generation surveys that were done in 2006 and in 2010. And this is a European Union program that's a huge sample, 10,000 respondents. Again, focused on a housing-based survey. So we're not picking up a lot of the migration data that would be useful. And then lastly, we have the European social surveys. These are easily accessible online. Russia participated in waves 3, 4, and 5. But again, not a lot of detail in terms of being foreign-born. However, what they do is include questions about the nativity of your parents, so you can at least get at the second generation, which can be really helpful for some other studies. But the major problem in the Russian Federation has to do with two things. Number one, it has to do with the fact that they don't do a lot of panel surveys, so it's hard to compare change over time. And number two, the sampling approaches tend to really focus on approaches that are not great for picking up migrants. They're not getting at questionable housing areas, they're not going into bad neighborhoods, and this makes things quite problematic. A third issue is that according to Decree 196 that was just passed a month and a half ago, you have to ask for state-sponsored public opinion surveys must be in Russian. And you can have, if someone asks you for a survey in another language, you can offer it to them. But since Russian is a national language, you have to do it in Russian first. And I think that, too, is going to make it very problematic to get migrants in these surveys to help with estimation. Now, we've got lots and lots of information now from the labor spravki, from all of these labor permits that are being granted out. They tell you where you can go, where you can work. It has all sorts of information about the age, sex, and origin of people. So we've got lots of sources in the US, we got lots of sources in Russia. Russian sources aren't quite as well suited towards looking at migrants. So then we had to ask a question. Okay, given that we've all got all these numbers floating around, is there systematic variation by who gives the estimate? Is there consensus about how many migrants there are? Is there consensus about how many are registered and unregistered? And so this is why you love to have graduate students, because you can make them go through years and years of newspaper articles. I helped too. I did just as many as several of my associates. But what we did, and Aaron Hoffman was our project director on this, we went through mass media reports, NGO reports, government statistics from 1995 up to 2012 to look at what was being published. What did we know? How many migrants were there? And what we find here is that in the mass media, what we get is just a lot of repeating, right? And not surprisingly, the mass media tends to repeat the highest numbers the most often, right? If it bleeds, it leads. So if we have a high estimate, we're going to say it all the time, right? But in general, what's surprising is that even in the US, where migration statistics are highly contentious, over time, we have a pretty small standard deviation here. People tend to sort of coalesce around reasonable estimations. There is that crazy 20 million migrant estimate out there, but that's Bear Stearns. And again, First of all, two words. Well, first, two things. Investment bankers, and we all hate them now, right? And the second one was, remember, they were really focusing on remittances instead of human bodies. And so really what we're looking at is a real consensus that there were somewhere between 12 and 11, right? And this is precisely the range that Jeffrey Passell in his studies has come up with. It's dipped down a little bit in the last year by about 500,000, according to his latest estimates, but it stays within this 12-10 range to a large part. So there seems to be consensus. In Russia, where consensus can be difficult to construct, we find something very different, right? When we're looking at government sources, they tend to hang down really low, right? They don't want to get sent away. When we're talking about IGOs, they kind of trend along with government sources. But then we get this great thing called other government sources, right? And these can be Vladimir Zhirinovsky spouting off that, yes, there are, if America has 20 million, we have 20 million too, right? This was not from Bear Stearns, but I really do believe that that was his motivation. Right? No, we've got 20 million, I'm sure. I can see him on the Metro. Many people really focus around the 15 million. I think it has to do with digit preference. But in general, none of these higher estimates display their methodology. They just give you the number, trust me, this is how many there are, and go about their merry way. Unfortunately, what we found in this assessment of over 450 published estimations of both registered and unregistered migration in the Russian Federation, 83% failed to distinguish between registered and unregistered, and 90% failed to talk about the data sources that they utilized in coming up with the estimate. So it is kind of one of the most famous books in migration studies is Beyond Smoke and Mirrors, and it's talking about U.S.-Mexican migration, and I kind of use that metaphor here. It's beyond smoke and mirrors coming up with these Russian estimates of migration. They're just, here's a number, and then I'll take it back. So we have some problems. But if Michigan teaches you anything, right, it teaches you that you can't just look at a problem, you got to find a way to maybe make a contribution to solve it and work that puzzle a little bit more. And when I looked at the data from this estimation, it's like, wow, we really have no idea. And what was amazing to me, and in all my expert interviews, nobody's got a clue. And when you sit down with the Minister of Labor in Russia and he looks you in the eye and he says, I wish I knew, I have no idea how many migrants we have. One would think it's a pretty big country, there's a lot of smart people, maybe you'll want to start thinking about counting how many there are. But I think it's a place where you can really foster a lot of useful international collaboration and really shift people from these speculative estimates up to analytical estimates. And I'm fortunate now to chair the U.S.-Russia Bilateral Commission on International Migration. We'll be meeting in November in D.C. This will be our third meeting, and one of the things that we're working on is sharing methodological approaches and data sets to help both countries kind of spiff up their migration estimation techniques. So that part of it, I think, has been really useful. And there's some basic things that I think both sides can benefit from. Really looking at individual census records being openly available. In the US, we have the PUMs, and you can go in and look at all this data. It's fabulous. Russia has never released individual census data. I don't think this is a fight that's ever going to get won, but it's kind of fun to fight it. So at least now there are people at Russtat that are working towards that. We're also looking at more school-based surveys. In Russia, by law, all children, like in the United States, have the right to go to school. Unlike the United States, migrant children only have the right to go to school if they can document that they have private insurance. Two guesses on who owns the private insurance companies, that's another talk. But what that does enable you to do is to look at the number of children's health insurance policies that are being established. And that gives you another really interesting piece of the puzzle to look at in terms of family migration. We can look at extrapolation techniques, and these are techniques that were specialized with by many of my colleagues, Frank Bean, Jennifer Van Hook, and others. We need to share questions on national longitudinal surveys, and we also need to work more with sending countries, right? How many people are coming in? So possibilities and whatnot. Okay. What is exciting to me is that we're now holding training workshops at the Federal Migration Service. So I'll be there in December running a week-long workshop, and has agreed to go in the early spring to do another workshop. So there's going to be some really positive movement in terms of working on these, the dissemination of better techniques. We're going to look more at family migration, which is an element that they kind of forgot. We're focusing on individual labor migrants for a long time, and so Yulia Florinskaya and others have been really looking at family migration and these private insurance policies that have been established for children. We're looking at sending country population data. This is slightly problematic because the censuses for Central Asia and the Southern Caucasus should only be used past 1990 with high caution, because in Georgia, for example, if you were not resident, if the male head of household was not resident, legally you lost title to farmland. And so, amazingly enough, although if you go to these villages, you will not find any men, if you look at the census data, there's thousands of them. So we've got a little work to do there. We also just finished a big conference in Washington where we did a modified replication of US estimation techniques. And what we did here is to work through the process that is utilized by the Pew Charitable Trust, and we modified it because we didn't have all the data that we needed for it. So we substituted for the CPS information, labor permit data, and also appeals that different oblasts put in to get more spaces, right? Because those were high demand areas. Great thanks to colleagues at the Pension Fund highlighted for me which oblasts, and 20 out of 85 of the oblasts in Russia have more individuals making payments into the pension system than there are pension accounts. So employers can get fined if they don't pay into the pension system. So they send the money in without a number, and they say the worker didn't give me a number. Yeah, right. But they're sending the money in, and so in 20 out of the 85 administrative districts, there are more individuals paying into the pension fund than they have registered. That's probably a good indication that you've got some undocumented migrants. In addition, we're looking at expanding surveys, and we've also got school data, thanks to the Ministry of Education, that shows at the current time there are over 700,000 immigrant children enrolled in Russian schools between first form and 12th form, so almost 1 million. Putting all this together and cooking it up, and if anyone's interested in the paper, I would be very grateful for any input, and I'll send you the paper this afternoon. We come up with 8 to 10.5 million migrants in the Russian Federation. There are 2.7 legal migrants in the Russian Federation. So again, the vast majority being unregistered migrants. And this number, I think, is really indicative. Because remember, in the US, we're ranging between 10 and 12. They're really in our neighborhood. And let's remember that the population of the United States is basically twice that of the Russian Federation. Now, it's maybe a little different in Michigan. I thought it was going to be different in Illinois, right? Because I was leaving from Texas, and from Texas, it's like, well, of course, it's got to be that high, right? In Illinois, we actually have a larger migrant population than we did in Austin, which I find very, very interesting. But I think here in Texas, or in Michigan as well, according to the statistics, things are changing, right? When Dr. Ostadal and I were in graduate school, we had to drive miles to get good ethnic food. Not so anymore, right? And so I think this is the upshot. This is the take-home point, that really using systematic estimation techniques, Russia has almost as many undocumented migrants as the United States. concluding thoughts. Who benefits? I think if you're going to have a takeaway point, first it's imperative to examine estimation things in comparison. It might not be the sizzle of migration studies, right? It's not as shocking as migrants living at construction sites and everything else, but it's the stake, right? It's the stuff we've got to have if we're going to really learn about this process. The systematic approaches are critical. We've got to really call people out on these, making up these numbers. But we also have to think about who benefits from the absence of comprehensive migration information. And there are three big constituents that have been identified to me by Vladimir Vasyslav Postavnin, who directs the World Bank migration project in Russia. The first is the government itself. They know they have a huge labor deficit. It's not something that they're particularly proud of. Russia is not enjoying the sort of economic stability that the statistics might tell you, and therefore the government would like to downplay the fact that the demographic crisis is worse than they thought, and they have all these empty positions. The second group are employers. It's way better to hire someone without documents who you can pay almost nothing and keep in fairly slave-like relationships than it is to actually go through the registration process. And the third element here is the criminal element, an organized crime. That doesn't mean that they're not part of construction companies or the government, as my colleagues tell me, but unregistered migrants are a great source of bribes. They're a wonderful mechanism through which to extract rents, as our economists would tell us, and this is an enormous business in the Russian Federation. According to my colleagues Alain Blum and others at INED in Paris, they've come up with an estimate that the migration industry in Russia raises about $40 billion a year. That's not small change. If they would, and they're not giving out grants to get better estimates on migration. So we also have to think about who might benefit from the establishment of more systematic efforts. And I think that that's something that the US and Russia both need to come to grips with and can really benefit perhaps from sharing these very diverse experiences on a very similar problem. Thanks very much.